Graham Frederick Young was born on the 7th of September 1947 in Neasden, northwest London. Young's mother, Bessie Young, unfortunately passed away a few weeks after he was born. His grieving father, Frederick Young, struggled to look after his young children and hold down his full-time job. It was decided it might be better for his young children to be around loving relatives while his father tried to get his life back in order. This arrangement also allowed Frederick to maintain a good relationship with his children. Graham lived with his aunt and uncle until he was about 3 years old, and in 1950 his father remarried and Graham and his sister moved back to his father's home. As Graham grew, the family, in particular his older sister Winifred, noticed Graham wasn't the most sociable of people, keeping just a small group of friends around him. He kept mostly to himself, but they didn't pay too much attention to this. They just accepted that he was a bit of a loner. He was a very intelligent child who excelled at school. In fact, his school witnessed his above-average grades, especially in chemistry, a subject he became obsessed with. Knowing his son's passion for chemistry, his father and stepmother bought him a chemistry set with which he would practice his experiments. He wanted to learn about different chemicals and how they worked. It would seem any form of chemistry intrigued him. As a youth, a much darker obsession took hold of Young. He became obsessed with Adolf Hitler and Nazism. He showed great admiration for Hitler, seeming to envy the power Hitler had over people. It was said he had wanted to be held in high regard, just as Hitler was in his eyes. This dark obsession would stay with him throughout his life. At the age of around 12, Young studied advanced toxicology at school, and by the age of 14 he'd started to play around with chemicals of a slightly different kind. He bought doses of antimony, gathering together small amounts of the chemical until he had a large amount. In fact, it was estimated when he was caught that he had enough poison to do some serious damage. His desire to see the effects of the poisonous chemical meant he needed guinea pigs, human guinea pigs. Those close to him became his lab rats. Young started off with different amounts of poison in their food, watching to see the effects the poison would have on his unsuspecting family, each time changing the dosage to see how much was needed before they started to feel ill. These periods of sickness became worrisome to the family. They thought they'd picked up some sort of ailment, with them all being intermittently sick, including Graham, who had accidentally poisoned himself when he forgot whose food he had put the poison in. But it wasn't just his family that felt the effects of the psychopathic boy. A friend of Graham's had bouts of sickness with similar symptoms as the rest of the Young family. It would later become apparent that these episodes occurred after Graham Young had offered food and drink to the unsuspecting young boy. On May the 23rd, 1962, Graham's stepmother died after a serious bout of stomach cramps and sickness. The hospital doctors were confused by her illness, and her cause of death was given as a collapsed bone at the top of her spinal column that she had suffered from a car accident a year before. Frederick Young was worried. He'd seen his wife die and his daughter fall sick on more than one occasion. What was going on? Was this just an accident from the tainted cutlery Graham had used in his experiments, or was it something more sinister? When his daughter Winifred was taken very sick, Frederick's suspicions had grown towards his son, and he confronted Graham, who did no more than blame his sister for mixing hair products in a dish, claiming it was that had made her ill. Graham upped the dose of antimony he was giving his father, resulting in him being hospitalised. The hospital doctors suspected poisoning, but wasn't sure which poison it was. Graham started to relay, in his own words, information he had on poisons to the doctors. His suspicions rising, Frederick Young demanded his son be removed from the room. Graham's aunt also began to feel as though Graham might be responsible for the strange illnesses she saw her family stricken with. She had had these suspicions for some time, but was reluctant to believe it. Graham's chemistry teacher also had his suspicions. Hearing of the illnesses those around Graham were suffering, he decided to check Young's desk, where he discovered a large amount of poisons. The teacher took his concerns to the head of the school, who thought it best Graham saw a psychiatrist, but they didn't want Graham to know what they were doing. So a confident Graham went into the meeting, enjoying the attention he was receiving, and was delighted to share his knowledge of poisons and how he could control his family's health through them. He went on to tell the doctor all about his exploits, showing his wide knowledge of poisons and toxicology. A shocked doctor looked at the 14-year-old boy sitting before him and realised he had to do something before someone died. He wasn't to know that Graham would admit to poisoning his stepmother years later. Graham admitted to poisoning the food with the antimony the police had found in his room. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder. While in custody, he was found to have a vial of poison that he was apparently going to take. He called it his get-out strategy, but it was found before he could take it. He was interviewed by a psychiatrist, Dr. Christopher Feiss. He diagnosed Young with a psychopathic disorder after Young had announced that he missed his poisons and the power they gave him. The psychiatrist advised that Young would do it again, as he lacked any moral understanding. At his trial, he pleaded guilty to the attempted poisoning of his father and sister, but wasn't convicted of his stepmother's death, as she had been cremated and it couldn't be proved. Young was placed in Broadmoor Top Security Hospital for the criminally insane for 15 years. He was 14, the youngest prisoner ever to be placed in Broadmoor. While there, he took full advantage of the library and continued to learn more about his passion. He invested as much time as he could to toxicology and poisons. Over time, it was noticed that some of the prisoners were getting sick. Why was this? Well, Young had managed to place chemicals in the tea. Things such as toilet cleaner and sugar soap was added to the urn when the tea trolley was brought in. Prisoner John Berridge had only been in prison for a short time when he died of cyanide poisoning. Young quickly claimed responsibility for it, claiming he had made the poison by extracting it from the laurel bushes that were all over Broadmoor grounds. They dismissed his claims and put the death down to Berridge unaliving himself. Without the attention and admiration he craved, Young knew he needed to get out, to be able to carry on his experiments without constriction. He knew he had to put on a pretense, to show the psychiatrists he was a changed man. Although it was all an act that was suffocating him, he managed to convince the psychiatrist, Dr. Edgar Udwin, that he was safe to be released into society. It's widely thought Dr. Udwin thought he was helping Young, seeing him as the 14-year-old boy who had been placed in a criminal hospital for attempted murder and not actual murder. And over the 8 years he had been there, he had changed into a responsible man, committed to giving back to society. But Young was clever and apparently a good actor. Udwin wrote a report to the Home Secretary and the Board of Governors, stating that he believed Young to be a changed man and capable of being released into the community. In 1970, Young was granted home visits. He wrote a letter to his sister informing her that he was coming to stay with her for a week. A slightly wary Winifred agreed, but would watch her brother around her child and husband. Young, knowing he had to be on his best behaviour, made sure the visit went well, and it did. By 1971, Young was released back into society, supposedly a changed man. He started off pretty well. Broadmoor Hospital secured a place through the government training scheme for Young at Hadland Laboratories that dealt in photographic lenses. For someone obsessed with poisons, specifically the one they used at the lab, thallium, a soft chemical metal that they used in their products, it was a gift. He got on reasonably well with the other employees who didn't know anything about Young and where he had been for the last 8 years. Young remained quiet once again, keeping himself to himself. Those that worked with him thought of him as a gloomy but intelligent man who knew all about chemicals. And when he told them that he was a failed chemist, they thought they understood why he was so knowledgeable about certain elements. Although the element thallium was used at the lab, it wasn't easily available on site. So Young had to find another way of obtaining the deadly poison. Once again he managed to convince a chemist to supply him with a large quantity of it. Thallium, a deadly poison that was easily disguised in water, was odourless and tasteless, was once again in the hands of Young, and he intended to use it. At least 10 Hadland Lab employees would be his next victims. One by one they experienced sickness, violent cramps and headaches. Some became so ill they couldn't work. Bob Eagle was the first victim of Young's. He had become very sick and spent a few times in hospital before returning to work. His co-worker was Young. Eventually, Bob Eagle's condition worsened and he was admitted to hospital, and after 8 days his health deteriorated and he passed away. His death report stated he died of bronchial pneumonia with a rare disease of the immune system. Poison wasn't even suspected. A few days later, Eagle was cremated. Young attended the funeral. His next victim was store manager Fred Biggs, who had become friends with Young. Sadly, Biggs died on the 19th of November 1971 after being violently sick. By this time, the Hadland employees began to think they were being plagued by a deadly mysterious sickness, and understandably they were all very concerned. Through all of this, Young made meticulous notes on all the conditions, ailments and end results his victims suffered. After Fred Biggs's death, the lab decided they would bring in outside help with the ongoing problem. Young, being Young, spoke up, wanting to be seen as the most knowledgeable about the sickness. He even went on to suggest that thallium might be the key to the problem. The experts who were dealing with this thought it odd that Young would know so much and contacted the police. In November 1971, the police checked Young's record, and to their surprise, they saw his conviction for poisoning. They headed straight to his home, where on entering they were shocked to see the inside of his house covered in Nazi memorabilia and shelves of chemicals. The most important thing that was found was the notebook that gave them all the information they could possibly want to have Young convicted for murder. An autopsy on Fred Biggs found that over time Biggs had ingested over 100 grams of thallium. Young was arrested. At his trial, he made a not guilty plea, claiming the deaths were due to a virus. But the prosecution had his diary, and they read it out loud. The jury, hearing the words Young had put on paper, telling how much he had administered to the men and the symptoms they had suffered. He wrote down every detail. He didn't have a leg to stand on. The jury took little time and brought back a guilty judgment for the murder of Biggs and Eagle. Graham Young was sentenced to life for each murder. Young's demeanour didn't change. He asked for a note to be passed to a journalist, and in it he requested the journalist make him famous. He wanted a waxwork model made of himself to go in Madame Tussauds' Chamber of Horrors, alongside some of the most notorious criminals. He needn't have worried. There were books about his crimes, films and TV documentaries portraying his life and crimes. Kind of got what he wanted, I guess. Concerns were raised about how easily the poisons were obtained and as to how Young managed to be released from prison. New legislations were put in order, and from 1972 the Poisons Act changed, making many poisons harder to get. Young was sent to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight, where he befriended the notorious child killer Ian Brady. The couple bonded over their fascination of Nazism, talking endlessly of their admiration for the movement. Young was shunned, even in prison. The other inmates, apart from Brady, avoided having to spend time with the prisoner. He wasn't liked. The fear of finding something in their teacups kept even the most hardened away. Graham Frederick Young was found dead in his cell on the 1st of August 1990. His official cause of death was said to be from heart failure. He was 42 and had no history of heart problems. A mystery? Maybe. Thank you for watching.